Welcome to another edition of the Conversations That Matter podcast. I am pleased today to have some guests with me, some very special guests from the Ars Politica podcast, which is a pretty new podcast. I would encourage you to subscribe to it. And the two co-hosts of that are Thomas Accord, who is the headmaster of a classical school, and Stephen Wolfe, who's done some writing for Sovereign Nations. Many of you are probably familiar with Sovereign Nations. And guys, I'd just like to thank you so much for being on and being willing to talk about a subject that many Christians are having a hard time navigating.
Thanks for having us on. Pleasure.
Yeah. So I want to start out with something that I heard from you on, I think it was your last podcast or perhaps the podcast before. I'm not sure if you've released one since then, but it was on a theology, or I should say a philosophy of place. And you articulated some things in that podcast. It was about an hour, that I thought were just very well stated. They're things that I believed, that I have, I think, articulated in different ways, but not quite as clearly as you guys did. And you worked through it sequentially, just orderly. And I really appreciate that. That helps people. And right after that, we have this big blow up about nationalism. And I see these things as so related. And so I want to help. This is the goal just for everyone listening. I want to help people who are Christians, especially, to navigate all the bad things they're hearing about nationalism. Some are feeling like they're being attacked because they love this country. They're confused by it. What does the Bible say about that? Why are Christian leaders condemning this? And so I want to come up with some clear ideas from Scripture, and then and just also, I mean, with the classical school background, just the traditions that have been passed down to us. I want to understand kind of where we sit in Western civilization. And so the first question, and I'll pose this to you, Stephen, if you don't mind. What is nationalism? What's all the crazy hoopla about this word that's so condemned?
What is nationalism? Well, that's a challenging thing to answer. I think your first instinct is to kind of disavow, or to say, well, it's not this, it's not that. And that's probably natural in kind of a post-World War II era. But I think that if you want to just, I think for a positive take on this, I think you should just first recognize that human beings tend to organize within these people groups, these nations. And this is recognized, I mean, not only classically, but also in the Christian tradition, as being the way that humans can share with one another. You have what some people have called a sort of symbiosis, this life together, and it's formed with these certain bonds that you develop over time, and these are often called nations, and they're nations because they have these cultural distinctives. Now, nationalism, I guess you could say that's a sort of ideology, maybe, but it really depends on how you define it. Nationalism could simply be that a people, as a people group, as a nation, arrange themselves in civil government, or through social institutions, through culture, and through these things, they kind of secure themselves as a people. Because there's threats from the outside, there's threats from the inside. So you could think of, I think, nationalism in a positive way as really just kind of the sort of the arrangements that a people set up to kind of protect themselves as a people.
So this is an organic kind of thing. This isn't a top-down, organized from some group of elites in a back room. This is something that just happens over time and as an extension of family. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, I think it can happen on a number of ways. I mean, it can happen from elites. Oftentimes, I guess in the best situation, you have elites who love their country, see themselves as having a duty not only to themselves or to some kind of globalist or to other aristocrats in other countries, but also to themselves as a people, seeing themselves as the people, like the group with an obligation to protect, to serve the entire nation itself. So, I mean, you can this arrangement can happen in a number of ways. It can come from the bottom up, kind of come from the top. But still, the idea behind it, you could say the best version of the ism of nationalism is simply the people kind of arranging themselves so that they can secure their way of life, the good of this collective, this sense of we, this idea that we are a people, we have distinctives, we want to protect them. It's good for our children, and for this reason, we're going to protect it and secure it.
You know, I was talking to someone the other day about this whole issue because it's so controversial right now for some odd reason. And this person I was talking to brought up the fact that Poland, and there's many countries like this, for many years did not have a political representation, but they retained their identity as a people. And you see artificial kind of borders being made. I think perhaps a place like Afghanistan is a good example, maybe I'm thinking of Iraq, where you have the Kurdish region and you have the Sunnis and the Shiites, and it doesn't really work. And it seems like people do sort of separate into groups based on certain factors. And Thomas, I know that you've traveled extensively in Europe, and you were talking about that in your last podcast. What kinds of things do you think, if you had ingredients and you say these are the things that make up a nation, what would you put in that or use to describe that?
Sort of things that I think Stephen already mentioned, that things that are natural among people, sort of like the love of place, myths, memories. Myths are big. Stories. I think there's a quote from Chesterton I saw the other day that said, "Without stories, there are no people. Without fairy tales or something." Symbols, traditions, customs, festivities. This is one thing I saw when I was living in Italy that I mentioned the other day. It was like every other week they had a holiday, a day off, and I didn't know about it, but they all knew. And it was a way that they told time together, a calendar. So these are sorts of things that take time to develop. They develop organically, and that's some of the ingredients.
So in Genesis 10, verse 5, it says, "The nations were separated into their lands," so there's place, "everyone according to his language, according to their families, into their nations." And I was reading that this morning, and I thought, that seems, and I like the basic elements, and from that we have, what you were just talking about, Thomas, the traditions and all these kinds of things, celebrations. We have what a people is, and that's something that seems to be worth defending. I think that's an obvious thing to most people who have grown up in this country, at least up until very recently. And so the thing I'm curious about is why that is being so maligned, the idea of standing up for your country and your people, the America first, or make America great again. These kind of taglines have been very vilified as something that aren't Christian. This is to either one of you. What is that all about? What do you think is motivating that vilification of someone wanting to defend and promote their people and the best interests of their people?
Well, I mean, I'll say first that I think one motivation for preserving and having this sort of national identity is the connection that Edmund Burke recognizes as the eternal society, which is a connection between the dead, the living, and the unborn. And that's not just the concept people throw out that, the dead get a vote and we need to think a lot about the future. It's more that the place that you live, the place that you work, the place that you love. This is the place where the imprint of your ancestors, the people who went before you, have left behind. I mean, really, when you walk around and you can get by and you can see the buildings and the streets and the people, their customs, ways, all those things are products of the past that have remained permanent in the present. Okay, so you can think, in some sense, the world that you inhabit is this life world. It shows forth the life activity, if you want to put that way, of the past, and in that sense, living in the present should be a form of gratitude for the past, because we can actually be free. We can make our own choices, have our own ends in life, because people in the past have created these things for us. And with that, you should then seek to conserve that for the future. If you love your children, want the best for them, and your grandchildren, your great, all, you're going to want to then conserve what you've been given as an act of, in some sense, act of piety to the past, but also in service to the future. And so and I say that because I think something's gone wrong, terribly wrong, if we're just very flippant about, yeah, it's just going to burn up. I mean, there was one preacher that said, I preach that America is going to, come to an end and its future demise and be replaced. Well, I mean, we know in the eschaton, that eschatologically, all these things are going to be replaced in a sense. But at the same time, the way we just kind of flippantly say, yeah, it's all going to burn up and go away. Who really cares? Or they have kind of a half-hearted concern. In some sense, I mean, really, that it's an odd expression of a lack of gratitude for the past, and also just this carelessness for the future. And there's something deeply kind of, I think, pathological about that. That we all in the West, in particular, I think this is not common. There's something weird about the West, that we would be in this state where we actually want to hate the past, critique and despise the past, and then at the same time have this carefree attitude about the future.
Yeah, that's interesting. It seems, so you mentioned a virtue there, gratitude. And, oftentimes I'll see, I think maybe Colin Kaepernick, when he started kneeling during the national anthem, is a good example of this. Some people were offended because they thought, well, hey, my grandfather fought under that flag, or, this represents sacrifices that have been made that I want to steward well. And of course, the other side was trying to make the case, well, that is not at all, what this protest is about. This protest is about present, systemic oppression, racism, etc. And there was such a divide, and it's still there. It's worse now probably than it was then. But a lot of these big evangelical elites took the side of Kaepernick in that whole dust up. And I think it left a lot of working class people who probably voted for Trump, who are, Christians who just go to church, live their lives, want to be left alone and continue their life as it is, confused. And, part of what I want to do is try to identify that. So I think, Stephen, you did a great job. I really appreciate that. It's a great explanation for, I think, why we value the past, why we have the identity we do. Why do you think that is hated, though, so much by the other side? The symbols of the past, that bind us to past generations, those kinds of things. What do you think? I don't know, Thomas, maybe you have a thought on this.
Well, I know it's been around for a while. If you go back and read people in the early 1900s, they're talking about this sentiment that despises place, particularity, and that favors universal. Well, they called it cosmopolitanism in the early 1900s. That was the word. We use globalism today, but and even the fact that Edmund Burke in the late 1700s is talking about this eternal society, and we live the past and in light of the past and the future. Yeah, the fact that he was even talking about that meant that these things were being challenged back then. So I think many people who, when they try to isolate what is causing this sort of oikophobia and xenophilia, as they call it, what's causing it? There are probably many causes. It's hard to pin down one because it's been going on for so long. But I think any explanation that we come up with has to account for that fact that it's been going on for a while. I think a lot of criticisms, for instance, of nationalism or any of these issues that we're talking about are often very provincial in chronologically, geographically, culturally. And so it's not something particular to America, or it's happening in the evangelical world. It's also happening in France. It's happening in different places. And some of these Eastern European countries are coming out of it right now, from having coming out of communism a few decades ago. So it's a broad movement. It's kind of everywhere. And I think don't want to get ahead of ourselves here, but I think So this nationalism that's going around is sort of a reaction to it, and that's happening everywhere also.
When someone on the evangelical left says nationalism, what I hear is that, I think is patriotism. I sense, okay, you don't love our country, right? And I think it's what a lot of working class Christians, that's what they're hearing. Like, what, you don't like being here? Why don't you leave? Why don't you go somewhere else, right? Yeah, as the logic goes. And in their minds, though, they're thinking that they're taking a stand against neo-Nazis. I mean, that's what they think. It seems like, at least.
Right.
And so, they're on some kind of a moral crusade to rid their country of these horrible people, which in itself seems almost like a nationalist or a great concern for the country, right? They're still viewing themselves as being plagued by some kind of outside force or internal force, I guess, that is encouraged by an outside force to revolt against the standard norms that they believe in. That's how they view it, at least in my thinking. And so, it seems to me like that's the big divide. And I wonder whether or not we're using two different, when we talk about nationalism, why is it that one side sees patriotism and one side sees neo-Nazi, extremists of some kind?
Well, I think. Go ahead, Stephen.
Oh well, I think the issue is that what divides, I think, between, you could say, the evangelical left and the right, or just the left and right, probably generally, excluding the center right, who probably agree more on the left than the right on this. But the idea that nationhood requires an active preservation, which must follow from a principle of exclusion. So if you have a certain group that has certain unique particular characteristics that are more than just kind of common humanity, and you want to preserve that distinct kind of particular group of people, so in cultural practices, that sort of thing, then you have to exclude people from that group. And this happens, of course, in churches. Churches do this, conservative churches do, actually all churches do this in one form or another. And that's because there's a certain standard that you want to set. Now, of course, you could, usually the principle of exclusion is going to be kind of exclusion from kind of mass change, like mass movements of mass immigration, that kind of thing. But I think the evangelical left thinks that somehow their theology and the gospel introduce this new inclusive principle. And so when they hear nationalism, they hear something that violates that command to be inclusive. And so I think just evangelical, like the evangelical lead broadly, because they tend to have this kind of like quasi separatism. It's like we want to love the city but not be of it, or we want to, like, this kind of this sense in which we are to like enter and do good and then retreat back behind the walls of church, that kind of thing. That leads them to adopt kind of a more inclusivist kind of posture towards their quote nation, because they don't see themselves as really fundamentally part of that nation. They see themselves kind of as separate, as kind of like just like I said, entering, doing good, then leaving. Whereas I think someone like Thomas and I, and the more people who'd be, I guess, right wing, we'd see that that we are part of this nation, the American nation. We're part of this, a distinct culture, distinct people group. And so we have to then implement in order to preserve that good, we'd have to exclude. So I think that's one reason why they don't like that. I mean, I think that they would, agree with that characterization. I think that's the divide. I also think to go negative and to where they probably won't like it. I think that this stuff is, the left is useful for progressive causes. That is why the evangelical left doesn't like the idea of nationalism. Well, if you destroy the past, and the past has an imprint on the present, then the present's tainted. The present is in need of reform. The present is something you need to now, through social action and political action, change. And so that's why that's why they despise the past, because then it frees, people who are connected to place, and people now have a negative relation to what once gave them, like, animated them and loved their place. And now it's a call to action to change for the future. And so it's a means of bringing you into a progressive kind of spirit to destroy the past. Why would you conserve a bunch of products of racists? So that's one thing. I think that's, my guess is that's probably more the motivation than the inclusivist part. But so yeah, it's this idea that if you don't have any connection to the past, if you despise the past, you're going to despise the present, which forces you to action for the future.
That's good. That's really good. And those two reasons, well stated. It's a progressive tool, but it's also because of the way they view themselves. And this is where we get into identity a bit. One of the things I've noticed in studying the progressive evangelical left is they tend to look at culture as kind of like this thing, like there's, they don't like borders in the real world, but they have, like, in their minds, a conception of America, or pick any country, and they are outside of that, looking in. They're not part of it. The church is not part of it. That's the vantage point that they seem to be viewing it from. And it's the mission, it seems like, of the church to then go and change this. So it's going to sort of like infuse, penetrate that bubble, what America, and it's going to change it and correct all the wrongs. And that's their mission, or part of their mission, part of the gospel. And I think for us, I know, speaking for myself at least, I never really viewed it that way. I thought of myself as living in a culture, living in a place that had certain habits and traditions and associations, ties that bound me to it, responsibilities that I had to it. And the church that I went to also inhabited that same place. And that seems to be a fundamental difference between the two views here. You guys had talked about philosophy of place, and I wondered, Thomas, maybe if you could talk a little more about that, because you did such a good job. What is it that naturally binds someone to a place, and then what is it that would cause someone to, if you have an idea on this, maybe separate themselves and then try to be kind of a reformer of that, or an outside force that's going to come in?
Well, what causes us to love a certain place? I think as you ask that question, one person that comes to my mind is a guy named Gouverneur Morris. Gouverneur was his first name, Morris. He was sort of like the grandfather of the founding fathers. And he wrote a letter to Alexander Hamilton, sort of exhorting him to be a patriot, a good patriot. And one of the things he says is that if we examine the climate and the countries of the earth, we see that the patriot passion is everywhere. People feel it for the burning sands of Libya, he says, like out there in this land. He says, on the frozen shores of, whatever other country, people love their frozen shores. They wherever they're from. And this is it's something that almost is formed in you when you're born, from the soil and the food that you're weaned upon, and before you even know it. He kind of starts to wax eloquent and poetic, but he says, but before we're able to think, the simplicity, the atmosphere, the culture, the climate, the habits of life that animate the people, they imprint themselves upon us. And it's almost like, he doesn't use this phrase, but it's almost like it's this invisible hand that's working upon us to bind us, and with the tenderness of our youth and the filial affection of our parents. And I think we quoted Cicero about seeing, he sees his old house, and all these memories flood back over him. The companions that you had, this tree that you used to climb with your friends, you see that tree, or if the tree falls down, it's like this, oh no moment, even though you don't even, it's just a tree, right? But it's all these things that are forming upon you without you even being aware of it. And so what could you call this? Time and place, and all of what Gouverneur Morris calls the mysteries of age. And so those are some of the elements. And I think you see this here. This goes back thousands of years. I always have this, being a classical guy, I guess I always have this broad view of things. If you go back thousands of years, you can see this with the story of Odysseus. And Odysseus, he leaves the Trojan War. He's trying to get back home, and he's a terrible sailor apparently. And he can't get back home. And he goes to this island, and there's this beautiful goddess who wants to stay with her forever. And he says, no, I got to go. And then there's another goddess. It happens again. And he says, no, I can't. I have to get back to my home. And he says, there's nothing dearer to a man than his own country and his own parents. However splendid a home he may have in a foreign country, if it be far from his father and mother, he does not care about it. So the whole story of this ancient tale, one of the most famous tales ever, 800 BC, 850 BC, is about a man wanting to go back home at all costs. And that says something. That's why it's called a classic. It says something to this perennial passion in man.
Yeah, that's good. And that seems to be a natural thing, a providential thing that God has infused in reality. And the question is then why, if that is so natural for someone, and it is, Father's Day, you give your dad a card, world's best dad. Did you really run the numbers on that?
Right.
No, it's your dad. This is a natural thing. Why is it something that the progressives seem to rebel against? Do you have an idea on that?
Well, I think that, you can make a case that it's been around for a while, but also Stephen mentioned post-WWII. It's kind of exacerbated and heightened, and R. Reno has a book on this called Return of the Strong Gods, and I think that's a pretty good book a pretty good explanation in his book of why this sentiment is really strong today. World War II, the interpretation post-World War II is that whatever was happening with Hitler and the Germans, it wasn't this anomaly. This is the interpretation. Okay, this is like the interpretation of postmodernists and different groups. It wasn't an anomaly. We look back at that and think, oh man, that was crazy. That came out of nowhere, didn't it? Well, no, it didn't, according to this interpretation. It didn't come out of nowhere. It was embedded in the spirit of Western man and Western civilization. And you can go deeper than this. It was embedded in males or Christianity or whatever you want to call it. But it's there, and it's there in this incipient form. And the whole project of post-World War II, philosophy and history and art, whatever, is to root that out, to find it. The question is not, is it there, but where is it here in this thing? And again, Reno does a really great job of exposing that, and other people have explained it as well. You can find this most prominent. So usually people trace this to like the Frankfurt School and critical theory.
Or Adorno's F scale. That's what that sounds like.
Right. The authoritarian personality. What is that book about? It's about that authoritarian character. There's a bunch of like transmutations that we call it different words today, like toxic masculinity or just being domineering, chauvinist, patriarchal, misogynist, racist,
mansplaining,
bigoted. Mansplaining, manspreading, whatever it is. All of these ideas are things that need to be suppressed. So how do you counter them? Well, this idea is of a closed society, so we need an open society. It's of a bigoted society, so we need a tolerant society. And everything that came out of the Western world, monogamy, the nuclear family, sort of this Puritan work ethic, I suppose, like all of these things need to be uprooted and deconstructed and subverted. And so you have these many projects people embark upon today. And so anytime you have any kind of sentiment, I think, that goes in this direction, people smell it, they sense it, and they wave a flag and people come running. So yeah.
Do you think it is so when we look at like the Enlightenment, some interpretations say this is a reaction against the wars of Europe fought for religion, so we need secularism of some kind. And now do you think there's a post-World War II a reaction against nations themselves, that actually it's not religion that causes people to fight, it's national pride, it's loving your home too much, and so we need to get rid of that, and only then can we have, Imagine by John Lennon, that world? I don't know, Stephen. Do you think that's? I mean, we're sort of in the tube, kind of trying to examine it, so it's hard. We don't have, we're not far ahead looking back. But do you think that's a fair analysis?
Yeah, I think that there is this. You can say World War II and Nazism. I don't want to say spooked, because that's giving them too much credit, but they were. Like Thomas said, they wanted to defeat and destroy and never let come back the idea of the strong gods, which would be a connection to place. This idea that this assertiveness, where you kind of stand at the border and assert yourself that this is mine, or ours. That sense of strength, of preservation, conservation, and what we've been talking about this whole time. So yeah, that was all kind of rejected. So this is why it's always kind of fascinating that things that we don't like is, quote, literally Hitler. And of course, Hitler did a lot of evil things, but so did the communists. I mean, communism killed 120, whatever it was, a tremendous amount of people. But somehow everything bad is actually this right wing, this nationalism. And whereas the left kind of gets a pass, you can have people, yeah, I'm a Marxist in universities. I mean, imagine having a fascist in a university.
Right.
Of course, they'd be kicked out. So everything is framed post World War II as this. We have to avoid Nazism bad, but then somehow the communists or the Marxists and the leftists are these people that we think are kind of goofy, but you know what, academic freedom.
Well, what's interesting though in that is that they don't attribute the technology, advances of the Nazis or the socialist ideas of the Nazis to be the real problems. They view the nationalism. That's the problem, and everything kind of nationalism has to bear the weight of all of it.
Yeah, people don't realize that, like Mussolini, he was an international socialist prior to forming the fascist party in Italy, and he just became a national socialist, which is, it is significantly different. That's why communists did hate the fascists, or did hate the fascists. Nevertheless, it was this nationalistic form of socialism. And that's what Hitler later and the Nazi Party later adopted, was National Socialism. And so, I mean, in some ways, I think we could say that they only, like you said, they only critique the nationalism part of it, and not so much the actual socialism aspect of it. But I think that the problem is that obviously that form of militaristic nationalism was a problem. So I mean, we're all gonna say, yeah, we don't want a Nazism to arise where he goes and tries to take over Europe or whatever. If you think that's kind of, unless you think that he just wanted to take over a little of Europe, but what ends up happening is that they throw out all sense of nationality, all sense of the idea of nation. And so they condemn places like Hungary for saying, we don't want to take in tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of migrants. They condemn that as racist, or they condemn that as bigoted, because it doesn't conform to this liberal project. They've thrown out all of the sense of nation. And I mean, and by the way, I mean, we don't have to get into this, but it supports international, it supports globalism. It supports, in the end, it supports this globalist elite that makes a tremendous amount of money, while at the same time diluting, destroying, and disrupting nations. I mean, it's war. They're fighting against, for their own gain. They fight against nature, which is people's sense of a sense of place.
Well, you mentioned globalism, and I want to ask either one of you, do you think that progressives, and this would include evangelical progressives, are unwittingly slipping into the same kind of error that the erectors of the Tower of Babel were slipping into? Uh, and I just read from Genesis 10, and it seems like there is a coming together of taking down all the kinds of barriers that would exist between peoples. And then, of course, putting them under some kind of totalitarian regime that's going to monitor them according to social credit or however they're going to do it. And this will unite. This seems to comport perhaps with this, I don't know, kind of an idea of utopia that we're going to, if it's not perfect, it's the closest thing we can get to it on earth if we just get rid of these things. That's what I sense. Do you see that as, because that's a serious charge if that's true, if evangelical progressives are trying to re-erect the Tower of Babel, do you see parallels there?
Well, yeah, certainly, because I think that evangelicals, and particularly the elite ones, they've adopted the post-world, what's called, like R.R. Reno, as Thomas mentioned, the post-World War II consensus, which is not Nazi bad, and it's always just about to arise. It's just around the corner, and we just got to fight it back. That urge to all become Nazis. And that's a little bit of exaggeration, but that's still kind of the basic theme behind post-World War II. And evangelicals have just entirely adopted it. And partly because they have this thing where they want to be kind of moderate, and to be moderate is to adopt the same, is adopt it. To be radical would be to say, no, nations are good. And so, yeah, I do think they've adopted that, but and the theologies conform to it. The theology of the evangelical elite is basically that I think, John, you've said things like, love the city, hate the nation, or something like that.
Yeah.
That's a little bit exaggeration. Probably they wouldn't like that, but but once you kind of deconstruct the nation and you become kind of globalist, well, the church is global, and the church is spread all across the world, and so we should be globally minded and not care about our particular national in-group. And so, yeah, that's going to it's going to support the free flow of labor across borders without restrictions. It's going to support all sorts of internationalism and globalism that's going to undermine national sovereignty. It's going to undermine people's ability to secure and protect their nation and way of life. It's going to cause massive disruptions, which are good for you because it's going to, maximize your consumption of goods and services, I suppose. But so I do think that they've adopted the post-World War II consensus, and they're just a part of it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was remembering back when you were sitting in seminary and realizing in one of my courses that the kinds of pastors that seemed to be trained, they were going for a pastor that would be kind of like have an international appeal, and very much for city urban kinds of ministries. But it didn't work. When I remember sitting in class, I remember hearing this one guy who's, he's going to graduate. He's probably pastoring somewhere now, but complaining about the folks back home, in Alabama or wherever he was going to go. And he'd have to go back, and they're all boycotting the NFL because they don't want to watch people disrespect our flag. And he thinks that's just stupid. And he's saying this in class. And I'm just sitting there like, man, like, you're going to have to minister to these people. Right. This is where you grew up. I just couldn't believe what I was hearing. But that's the mentality it was not corrected by the professor. I mean, the professor instead was trying to teach him kind of like, well, how do you shepherd people into the right view? And it was just like, what? Right. And so they're training people, though, very much for this sort of to be international leaders that don't have a place, that are kind of like they can just move around, I guess, wherever and be successful, not tailored to, the kinds of people that they're going to actually have to minister to in the real world. And I know that churches, because before I left, I had heard they had to implement all these new kind of Christian discipline courses because their graduates were not doing well. They were having a lot of problems with churches splitting, and I'm sure that problem's been exacerbated now. And so anyway, thinking through that, it seems like that's the neo-evangelical kind of model, is to train for international kind of leadership without these national distinctions. Which, I don't know, just, it was a side thought I had that was just kind of interesting to me, that sparked when you were talking there.
Well, I'll also add, if I can, that
Please.
they not only are they trained to be kind of these kind of global or international leaders, but they also have the mentality that will then kind of form people in their congregation to be basically global citizens. So because if the nation itself, if the nation as a people is the way that you resist kind of this outside encroachment, this globalism, if the nation is that thing that and is what the thing that can resist globalism, and if you undermine some national loyalty or the sense of place, and you become more and more in sentiment this kind of sort of global, internationally minded Christian, you're being kind of socialized and formed into the globalist system. Basically, you're being you're being socialized into the very thing that the globalists want you to become. And so I think that in a large part, I mean, evangelical professors, but also pastors are just shaping you to be like that.
That's interesting. There was an essay I read years ago by Richard Weaver. I don't know if you've read it, called Two Types of American Individualism. And I want to get into this idea of identity, because what it argues essentially is that there's sort of an individualism that comes from the North and an individualism more in the South. And in the South, there's more of a sense of what you were talking about, Stephen, with attachments that you grew up with, obligations, ties that bind you to people and institutions, etc. Very organic. But in the North, it was kind of this Walden Pond kind of, I'm an island, to myself. And I think we see this kind of more in kind of libertarianish ideas today, or circles today, where people, when they talk about individualism, often they don't want any kinds of bonds, social bonds. But of course, there's another kind of individualism that wants those social bonds, but it doesn't want socialism. And so I was hoping that you could sort of help us navigate towards, because I think there's an identity crisis. How do we help people, whether it's shepherding? I know, Thomas, you have a school, so I'm sure you have people coming from broken homes who have moved everywhere, who, what kind of sense of place do they have? What makes them who they are? How do you help people cultivate an identity that is not an island and not socialism, but actually, I think, and hopefully we can bring some biblical principles to bear, but is a person who is acknowledging the sovereignty of God, providence of God, in gratitude, in forming the situation that they were born into, and all the things that go along with that. So, with that, Thomas, how do you deal with that with maybe students or people in your life? Have you helped people that have had identity issues sort of understand kind of their place and who they are?
I think identity, there's many ways of layering it. My identity as a man, and my identity as an American, or as a Southerner, I'm also in the South, or as a Westerner, or as a Christian. And each of those layers are being attacked. So it's not like there's any one. I think one of the failures of today is to pick one of those identities and sort of blow it up to the exclusion of.
So you're in Christ. You're just in Christ, and that solves everything.
Right.
Okay.
Or you're you're like transgender, and you have to go. It's like the new CrossFit. You have to go around and tell everyone everywhere all the time, this is your identity. Sorry if you do CrossFit, whatever. Okay.
I don't do CrossFit. No.
Okay.
No.
Okay. But so one thing I'm a student of history, and what I tell people, if you want to get into history, one of the best things to do is read biographies, read stories of people. It's the memory of these people, and you as sort of their posterity, their descendant, that begins to bind you to something solid in the past. I think also Edmund Burke, we mentioned him earlier. He said they will not look to their descendants who do not look to their ancestors. And so this idea of having identity for me as an individual, it really doesn't, or if I can give an analogy, we have art students, and every student wants to draw or paint something out of the inner awesomeness of their self. And we tell them that's not how great art is made. Great art is always made by you studying some master, copying and copying and copying their works, and eventually doing something a little different based upon that. So trying to find identity as an individual, I think is you're sort of you're shortchanging yourself. You're cutting yourself off short. You need to find these things that are beyond you and see yourself in a broader stream of something. And that could be your state history as a Louisianan. It could be your national history. It could be your Christian history. And I think all of those are healthy layers. Your family history. So classically, what do we do as a classical school? We don't focus on at the state level. At most, we have a national history, but more broadly, we teach a Western history. So one of the things in classical education is we're trying to pass on a culture. That's part of what education is, passing something on. What is that culture? And this cultural identity, these loves, these affections, these tastes and habits, we're passing on a Western and a classical and Christian culture. And so there's a very clear set, defined, agreed upon, books and ideas. And it takes a long time. You might be thinking, okay, so what books how long is this? Yeah, it's going to take about 12 years, right? Really, of you absorbing this material and doing it while the world is trying to undo it. So it has to be this it's not something that we can just kind of passively grow up in today. You have to actively turn your mind toward it and take it on for yourself. And we do that at our school through, again, we read all the great books. Obviously, we read the history of science too. Those, like, how did that develop? So we take everything. Every morning we have like this calendrical prayer that we, what happened this day in church history or Western history. And so it's sort of this washing over time. And ideally, my goal would not be to produce people who are merely Westerners. I would rather something more particular. But I think at where we are right now, merely recovering a broad Western tradition is task enough in itself. It's sort of, people talk about classical education as we're rebuilding the ruins of this once great cathedral. And well, where are we in that stage? I think we're at the stage of trying to fix the foundation. Later on, we can talk about rooms and things, and maybe other people, that's their area of work, but mine is sort of at the bottom right now.
That is excellent. And that, it sounds kind of like what God instructed the Hebrews to do in remembering the crossing of the Jordan by a monument that would have stood the test of time. The children would, get an opportunity to ask, well, what happened there? And then it forms an identity within them, just like their peculiar habits that God implemented as well. And this is something that it means a lot to me. And I'm happy to hear you say it's not just Western. And I realize, it's just kind of like I feel like we're hanging on. We're trying to recover these basic things, but I'm a localist, and there's regional things that are so special. And I'm seeing this even with progressives. And this is one of the things I wanted to ask: is it inescapable to have some kind of an identity tied to place, even if you hate the nation? I see progressives, they have these farm markets and stuff, and they want organic vegetables. You know what I'm talking about, right? You've been there.
Yeah. Eat local, buy local.
Yeah, buying local. It's a very big thing in progressive circles. Is it inescapable? I mean, is this just how God's wired us? We love place. It seems to me like it is, and you can't really push that down for inevitably. Like it's going to come out somewhere. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's natural. if you can find people talking about this in all cultures at all times, essentially, that every individual is disposed to love those near to them. In fact, I think it was John C. Calhoun who talked about the concurrent majority.
Yes.
The whole reason for that was that politically people are disposed to prefer policies that affect them locally, because that's as Aristotle talked about that. I can go on and on and on, but he said friendships extend, or cities extend as far as friendships do. And so I know you can naturally, artificially extend them further, but he's just thinking in an ancient sense. This is how we function. It's how we think. The human mind can't account for all variables past a human scale, so to speak. And that's something in political philosophy people don't talk about a lot. Is what is a human scale for a nation? How far can our allegiances and our loves and our can they be extended so far that they're so thin they break? So yeah.
That's a really good point, because I think the evangelical elites tend to have this idea of, loving the whole world. And we should all have, it should be a love we have for humanity, but it's kind of like, I think what you just said about stretching the cords too thin, that's what it feels like. I can't go to every country. No matter how much money I have, I can't give to every cause. There's only so many things I can do. Right. And in God's providence, I got to invest that into what he's put in front of me. And that seems like the obvious place, first to the household of faith, first to your family. Whoever doesn't provide for them is worse than an infidel, right? So we have these things in Scripture. How would you, and maybe this is more for Stephen, I don't know, either one of you, but how would you respond? I know you are responding on Twitter, but give me a help for those who might be in a church where their pastor is saying nationalism is wrong, loving your people is wrong, that's racism, etc. Give us some tools for responding to that. Stephen, you want to go?
That's tough. I mean, I can't say that I have any great wisdom on how to deal with that situation in particular in a church. Kind of nervous to provide. I don't want to say leave. It really depends on the situation, but I think that having.
Yeah, let's just say the pastor's ignorant. They heard this in seminary, and now they're preaching because they think unwittingly, well, this is what Christianity is, because every tribe, tongue, nation, Revelation 7, and now you're there, and you're kind of like, well, I don't want to feel guilty because we're not diverse enough or whatever. I like our potlucks. I like our our songs and that kind of thing. There's nothing wrong with that.
Well, just practically, if this is something that the pastor just goes on about, I would just, and you have the ability to perhaps go to a different church, just go and don't, there's nothing wrong with going to a different church. And I would just recommend that you kind of announce to the elders your decision, maybe even request to leave, to go to a different church. I've done that before, where I just requested to move to a different denomination, and they just said yes over another theological issue. So I mean, that's one thing to do, but that's the last resort. I think that you should try to engage them and the best you can, kind of explain the goods that are provided by this sense of nationality. And the theology, and I mean, it's challenging because you have to bring a lot of theology to this. You'd have to make distinctions between nature and grace. You'd have to say, look, we're all naturally human, and so we tend to, we need this nation, or this sense of place, and this sense of we out into the world, not just in the church, but actually out into the world as well. Into kind of civil society, and those things are all worth preserving. And I mean, you just have to bring the best arguments you can. But otherwise, if the pastor just goes on and on about that in sermons and denounces the very things that you think preserve that are for your good, then you may want to just peaceably kind of leave that church. But I'm hesitant to provide that advice, but I think that might be in the end the best thing to do.
Could I explain, I guess, one thing that helps me in this? So one of the things that I don't mean to plug classical education here too much, all right? But one of the
That's
things that
fine.
drew me into this was the idea of rootedness. Traditions are things rooted in time and experience, and so the modern world is sort of this world that's cut itself off, and we're drifting around in our relationships. We don't know what gender we are, and all this crazy stuff today. Well, how do you know? You align yourself with the predominant preponderance of humanity and human experience. And there's a lot of people in history that have written contrary on nationalism, on natural affection, contrary to what you're hearing today. Thousands and thousands of people. And I don't mean to plug something here, but you're asking, I think this would help people. A colleague and I have been working on something for a while, which is basically like an anthology of natural relations. And we're trying to get it out and publish it as soon as we can. But it's several hundred pages of people, and it's Presbyterians, it's Catholics, it's Greeks, it's Romans, it's Jews, it's Chinese people, it's people in the 3000 BC, it's people in the 100 AD, all speaking about natural social relations and the things we're talking about here in a way that demonstrates that, I guess, what we're expressing is natural, normal. Christians come along and say things like, God arranged it this way, his benevolent hand of providence. Yeah. So I think, to me, I put this together because it helps me when all around me is blowing in different directions. I know that this is an anomaly, these views today. It's an aberration on the historical scene. And so, I mean, I don't like promoting myself or whatever, but we are trying to put this together and publish it.
So it's not done. Is there a website though, or where people can get an update? Or
no, I don't.
Okay.
It's just a file, and
you'll have to come back on. You'll have to send it to me.
Yeah.
I've seen versions of it. It's pretty impressive. I'm looking forward to that. Another thing I would say is ecclesiology is really important. I mean, I'm Presbyterian, and so I this may not be the perfectly Baptist take, though I think it could be. But I think that if we tend to, in evangelicalism just broadly, it's not just the elite, but everyone, we tend to place too much on the institutional church, that this association that we have as members of this church is supposed to satisfy like every human Christian and Christian need and good that we have. And so we see the church as, wait, no, this is your new citizenship is heaven, and this is located in the church. And so you can renounce your earthly one. This is the place where you're a holy nation, so you don't really need that other nation, or it's just kind of secondary. This is the place where you learn ethics, and everything is in the institutional church. Of course, and the pastor becomes a CEO and all that, but at times. Just because so much pressure is placed on them to do all this stuff. Every human needs there. And I think that is just a faulty view of just a bad ecclesiology. And I think we need to say that they are two different institutions. You have civil and you have ecclesiastical. Each of them has a role in your life, and one does something that the other cannot do, or at least cannot do well. So the obvious one for the civil realm is, it can do fire departments, but the church can't have a fire department, probably not, unless you're really big, or police department, or all sorts of things. So I think that the importance is to see your church as a place that provides spiritual good for eternal life, for the gospel. It also trains you in moral theology and some of the other things. But that you have to not see that as, well, ideally the church is this political church and is where we go. No, you have to, both realms provide the human, for the Christian, with these needs. And so that means that the nation, which is something that doesn't have to be separate from the church, doesn't even have to be outside the church. Nevertheless, it does, being non-ecclesiastical and as an institution, is this thing that provides you these national these goods as a human being. So I guess the bottom line is we shouldn't see the institutional church as a replacement for like Tom was talking about, like these classical authors talk about the importance of place and nation. The gospel did not replace that and then implant it in the church, as an institution. These two different realms, if you want to call them, ecclesiastical and civil, provide each a unique set of goods, and we shouldn't make one like the replacement for the other.
Well, this is where my heresy meter starts to, my yellow flags at the very least start going up and I've seen what you're talking about. I know exactly what you're talking about, where we expect the gospel to accomplish things that the gospel was not intended to accomplish in this realm, in this life, and kind of almost adding to it. Really, that's where my heresy meter starts going off. Adding to it that this is somehow part of Christian identity is, and I've seen this. I don't know if you've seen this, where especially men, women not as much, but men, and it may be women, but maybe it's just because most of my friends, I hang out with men and I hear more what they're saying, but it doesn't always work well with men when let's say a person goes to church, they get saved, and now all of a sudden they're kind of being told, or at least it's implied, that they should be at church for everything and all their needs are here, fulfilled here. And, whatever they used to do, whatever hobbies they had and civil, activities they were involved in, civic stuff, they can't, that's not really, it's sort of second tier. Like, you really want to be sitting in every time the church is open, you got to come here and sit and listen to lectures, etc. And men that's not how we are. It's like, we go ahead.
Yeah. So, right. So we tend to think that all of life needs to be kind of inside the church, the institutional church, and it needs to be a kind of a program. It needs to be something that the church officially does, that you participate in.
Bingo.
There's a difference between you studying, manhood, like a masculinity, with a pastor in a formal Bible study at official program. That's one thing, and that's fine.
All right.
But it's a different thing as well, and it's a good thing for men of the same church to just talk and do things together
organically
outside of the church, but not as an official program. And in some sense, that's a civil thing, even though you're Christians and you're from the church. It's an outside, it's like an extra ecclesial thing you're doing with Christian men. Let's say you're building something, or you're, whatever you're doing outside.
I do a lot of like hiking and outdoors activities, and I would just hang out with guys from the church, and go, but we didn't think it was a worship service, but a lot of social formation happens in those, sometimes more formation happens in that.
Yeah. And I think that it would be good to think of that as not as a church thing, but as a human thing that is, you could say adorned or accented, whatever word you want, with Christianity. So you're doing a very human thing by hiking. It's not an official program of the church. And yet you're doing it as Christians. So that's kind of what I'm saying, is that you can think of these two separate realms, and both are good. Both are these good things that as humans you need.
Yeah, that's really good. Thomas, any final thoughts? I want you guys both to plug kind of your website and everything as well, if you have one. But any thoughts you want to add to that?
To anyone who's just kind of confused about all of this and hearing different things from Christians and the culture, just to reiterate something I said earlier, there's a lot of people out there, present and past, who have said otherwise, and who have validated, I'd say, and reinforced this sort of natural feeling that you might have, or natural revulsion from the things you're hearing today. And those people are accessible. If you want, I can give you some things to look at, to read, and you can check our podcast out. We kind of talk about this as well, Ars Politica. But and just be encouraged, but also know that recovering this sort of identity of any sort, it takes time and it takes consistent maintenance today. And the best thing you can do is to get into it now and get into it with other people who are around you. And for me, that happens at sort of a young level for children. So if you have children, you have to be active about this with your children. You can't be passive and just say, they're going to figure it out or whatever. Like they need more than the nuclear family is very important, but they need more. They need a community of people doing this together. So almost every city or town, you can find people who are pursuing, recovering sort of Western Christendom.
You're saying it takes a village. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, it takes a village, right? Yeah.
That's really good. No, that's excellent. And I mean, I want that for my kids too. I feel like I grew up, now I'm realizing it's unique, but we would go to historical landmarks, and I was homeschooled, and I was proud to be a Harris. I was proud of, I don't know, just I was thankful, really. I say pride, but it was this gratitude to be in America, to be a Christian, all these things. And
right.
Just how rich that is.
Yeah.
Where can people find you? I know you said people can reach out to you. What's the best way to do that? Twitter?
For me, you can find me on Facebook. Just Thomas A. Cord, or Twitter. I mean, you can email us at arspoliticapodcast@gmail.com. Also, you can check out my school. I don't really like plugging that though, but I teach at a school, or you can just email me and we could talk about it.
Well, I'll put the links in the info section.
Sure.
So I'll put the Ars Politica link there, and people can subscribe. But you guys on iTunes or just YouTube or where?
Yeah, okay. All the podcast places, Ars Politica.
Gotcha. Stephen, where can people find you? Same place?
The same.
Okay. Well, I know you both are on Twitter and Facebook, and I enjoy your posts. And I'll put those links in the info section for anyone who wants to follow Thomas A. Cord or Stephen Wolf on Twitter. Thank you guys so much for coming on and explaining some of these things. I know we're just hitting the tip of the iceberg, but this is immensely helpful for so many people, even the people that just want to be reinforced in the idea that they're not crazy. You guys have helped, and I appreciate that.
Thanks for having us on.
Yeah,
John, is great.
Yeah, God bless. Well, I hope you enjoyed that, and hope it was helpful to you in understanding why progressives go after nationalism. Now, there's many more things that could be said. In fact, I talked about the fact that nationalism as a term was first used by socialists, by Edward Bellamy. He was a cousin of Francis Bellamy, who gave us the Pledge of Allegiance, and he formed these socialist clubs that he called nationalist clubs in the United States in the late 1800s. And it's interesting to me that the origin of this term and the way it was used, now it's kind of viewed as kind of an over-the-top patriotism by the progressive left. That's what it seems like, at least. But I went through some of the history of the use of the term and what I think the term means today. You're going to want to check that video out if you haven't seen it. Beth Moore and Christian Nationalism. I'm putting the link in the info section for this video. Also, Stephen Wolf and Thomas A. Cord are recording a video specifically on Christian nationalism. So we didn't actually get into that. We were planning on it, but I don't know if it slipped my mind, but Stephen told me after I pushed the button to stop recording that they were planning on doing a whole episode on this. They have a lot of thoughts, and they're going to get more into this idea of mixing kind of civic and then ecclesiastical symbols and roles and that kind of thing. And, is that appropriate? When is it appropriate, if ever? Those kinds of questions. And so we kind of, hopefully this was kind of the precursor to that. This is kind of the intro, and hopefully that's going to help you a little more as they talk about it. So I would encourage you to go subscribe to their podcast if you want to hear more about specifically Christian nationalism and what that is or isn't. And hopefully that'll be helpful to you. Until next time, God bless.